talk about the GWT's user interface. I might say GWT, I might say GWT. I'll really try to stay consistent, but it's tricky. Everyone seems to say something different. So I want to talk to you guys about GWT's user interface library, right? And here's kind of the topics I want to go through. Just a little bit about layout, some stuff about using CSS with GWT, patterns for building user interfaces, and some tips, tricks, and gotchas in some cases. So the thing is, really, these topics, you could actually spend a whole talk or many talks on bunches of them. So really, I just want to try to hit on a lot of the main points just to at least get your interest so you can see what's out there. And then if there's questions, that's great. It at least gives you a place to start with. So let's get started here. So what's layout, right? Layout is really the arrangements, the arrangement of UI components on the screen. Right? It's like, or you have widgets and all that, but where do they go, right? And how do you do this in GWT? Well, you use panels. We have this concept of something called a panel, and the thing about a panel is what it lets you do is it's something that it's a special type of widget that lets you that allows you to add other widgets to it, so it contains widgets. So you might say like, well, why do I need panels, right? Like, why can't I just say I want to put this here, like? I'll just say the left and the top, like just stick it here and stick that there, and that's great. I mean, that's easy. What's all this crazy business about panels? Well, the reason why layout's important is, let me show you here, right? So here's the kitchen sink sample, and I'm not trying to knock our kitchen sink sample. It's not about that, right? I'm just trying to demonstrate a point here. And so here's a pop-up, right? And pop-ups, the way they work is it's absolutely positioned. You say, okay, well, the left and the top, it sits here, right? But look what happens, actually, if you go like this, right? I mean, that's not good for business, right? That's just kind of like hanging out there, right? And that's because of absolute positioning. So, this is a pop-up. It's not that big a deal, but you can imagine if you said, hey, you know what? All my layout's absolutely positioned. This is great. Well, it's going to look like junk when someone resizes the window, right? Another interesting thing that happens, actually, related, is when you use fixed width or fixed units for specifying dimensions. So I say the width is 200 pixels. The thing about that is, so that's what's said here, maybe not 200 pixels, but what happens if I change the font size, right? See, the width still stays at 200 pixels. It really listened to me, but look at what happened, right? The height wasn't constrained, so it tried to wrap, and now you got a really long pop-up, right? Well, it disappeared now, but so these are some of the things that you really can't control. You can't account for all of them, so that's why there's a layout manager, and that's why there's layout. That's why layout exists. So let's just talk about some of the panels that exist, right? There's a horizontal panel and a vertical panel. These are called like cell panels, kind of. They inherit from cell panel. The reason is you can think of each entry in them as like a logical cell, right? So here's some code demonstrating how you could do something with a horizontal panel. You would add, say, like, I want to add my widget, then my widget 1, and what's going to happen is it's going to stack from left to right, and that's how it's going to work. And then I can say, well, I want to set the horizontal alignment. So for the first widget there, I want to actually center it in its cell. So I'm going to say, okay, well, just set the alignment to center, right, for that widget. Vertical panel would work similarly, except it would stack from top to bottom, and you would be working with, instead of like a horizontal alignment, be vertical alignment, so top to bottom, right? And these are like kind of like the basic panels, I would say, the more basic panels. Then you've got actually a dock panel here, and the thing about the dock panel, it's kind of an interesting one. The way it works is you add widgets to it, and they dock on the outer edges, with the orientations being like north, south, east, and west. And the center is special because when you add a widget to the center, it takes up the remaining space, that all the space that remains. So really, you can add multiple widgets to you could add like 2 widgets to the north part, to the south part, or the west, or the east, or whatever. And whatever you put in the center is going to take up the rest of the room. So it's kind of a special panel that way, and it's useful when you have like your main content window in the center there, and other things that drive it on the outside. And you can only add 1 widget to the center. If you try to add more than 1, then it won't let you. So you might have heard of flex table and grid, right? Like we have flex table and we have grid, and you might say like, well, why do I even need all these other things, right? I can do all these things with flex table and grid, right? And okay, so Flex Table and Grid, they're tables, right? I mean, their name kind of tells you that. But their API is providing functionality that's very specific to tables. Like there's add row, add column, you know, set the text at column row 0, column 0, things like that. The thing is, with like a horizontal panel and a vertical panel, you don't need all that, right? The job is to lay it out horizontally, lay it out vertically. Why do you care about rows and columns? So it's not a matter of, well, I mean, I don't need those because I have something more powerful. Like take, for example, if any of you use Swing, there's grid bag layout, right? You know, I mean, you could have used that, but that was a disaster, right? I mean, you could do like 10,000 things with it. So you could do everything, but when you looked at it, you could do nothing because you're like, I don't know how to deal with this thing, right? So that's why these panels actually try to simplify. They're very specific, and dock panel is actually a little bit of an interesting one. I don't even know if you could easily build a dock panel using our grid and table, Flex Table and Grid APIs actually, because of the centering, the taking up of the space in the center there. And then, you know, sometimes people ask, they're like, you know, HTML tables, man, I mean, like, what are you, back in 1975? Like, what are you guys doing, right? Like, you compile Java to JavaScript and use HTML tables? Well, here's the thing about it, right? And I mean, I'm a little new to this too. It's that, you know, actually laying things out horizontally and vertically like tables is not actually that simple in CSS. You know, you got to do a lot of trickery to get it right. And there's just to show you like a really simple example here. Well, not the code for the simple example. I just made like a really simple thing here. So this is just like, I mean, we have like some, this is just straight up HTML and CSS. This isn't GWT. This is like a red widget and a green widget, let's say, right? And I've laid them out next to each other. I did not use tables, right? So I basically used some floats and whatnot. But see the background here? Yeah, good, it's coming up there on the slide, like the gray background there. So the thing is with a panel, the horizontal panel, you might say like, oh, you know what, I lay it out horizontally. Now give this a gray background, and you want it to actually appear kind of like this, right? Or so that it actually underlies everything. But the only way I could actually get this to happen is that I actually had to explicitly say what the height of this background, what the height of the background would be, you know, so that it knew what area to fill. And you can do it without doing that, but it is very, very tricky. But a table does this for you automatically. It automatically says, oh, you know, he added something smaller here and something's taller here, but really in the end, it's really that big. So when you put a background there, it looks nice. So tables give you a lot of good things with layout that is really hard to achieve in CSS. Hopefully that'll change, though. Hopefully that's going to change in the future. And if you don't want to use tables, you're like, you know, you guys are crazy, man. I just don't want to use tables. Well, there's a flow panel, and a flow panel is just a straight up div. So you can do whatever it is you want to do with that div. So here's these other panels that are kind of like, I call them panels that show one widget at a time because they show one widget at a time. So I'll just show you like the kitchen sink just briefly here. There's one called a disclosure panel. So it's right here. So it says click to disclose something. So I click here, and then it shows a widget below it. So the idea is that you always have something that's showing, and you can toggle something below it. Tab panel is really familiar, right? Really, it's showing just this kind of widget now, but when you switch tabs, it shows these other widgets, but they're hidden till then. And stack panel, we don't have an example in kitchen sink, but if you look in the mail sample, stack panel is kind of like these things stack up, and when you click on them, you show their associated widget and hide the other ones. So now let's talk a little bit about panels that use absolute positioning, because they exist. We have something called absolute panel, right? And the idea about this is, the thing about absolute positioning, it's kind of funny, right? The way it's defined, it says, okay, if you set something to position absolute, it is still relative to its containing block, where containing block is defined in like 10 pages of specification, right? So the thing about that is it's kind of tricky to know what the containing block is. So the thing is, we've created something called an absolute panel. And when you add something to the panel, you say like, I'm going to add my widget at position 200 and 400. The coordinates are always relative to the upper left corner of the absolute panel. Yeah, that's your origin. So by having the absolute panel, that is your containing block, as opposed to arbitrarily setting, you know, position absolute on some widget yourself. you may not know what the containing block is, or it may not be as obvious. You can figure it out, but it's good that we provided this for you. The root panel is kind of interesting. I mentioned it here. It's the base panel to which all widgets are added to. So at the end of the day, to show something up on the screen, it has to be added to the root panel, right? And really it represents the body element. And it's a subclass of absolute panel. It is an absolute panel itself. A pop-up panel is pop-up panels is really used as you all know, pop-ups to basically show contents on top of the page's contents already. And you can do, and the way you set its position is you say, set pop-up position with left and top, and the coordinates are always relative to that of the root panel, so to that of the body of the document. So, and the way you show it is you call show, and that shows the pop-up panel, and hide to hide the pop-up panel. And you can also set the pop-up panel to be auto-hide, that behavior where it shows up, but when you click away from it, it actually hides itself. Now, the interesting thing about pop-up panels is they're automatically attached to the root panel. So when you call show, it actually will automatically attach itself to the root panel. And when you call hide, it detaches itself from the root panel. So sometimes you see people like they're adding a pop-up panel to another panel, right? That does nothing. In the end, it really does nothing, because when you call show, you're always relative to the root panel. So that's also a reason why the root panel is actually an absolute panel. The other interesting thing is, well, you've got set pop-up position. One thing we noticed in GWT 1.4 is, well, what happens if you need to set the position of a pop-up based on its content? So for example, centering. You can't center a pop-up unless you know how big it is. You just can't do it, right? But the problem we had was like, okay, because we do this detachment and attachment behavior, you can't know what the size of the pop-up is until it's shown. So what do? Do you show the pop-up, then compute where it should be, and then basically set the position? The problem is you get an ugly jump effect, right? Some browsers you don't, but you basically see it and you just see like a flicker as it jumps to the center of the screen. So what we did was we added a method called set pop-up position and show, where you can pass in a callback object. And that callback is executed right at the time that the pop-up is attached to the DOM, but right before it's shown. So, and in there, you have access to the width and height of the pop-up. So basically, you can use that to set the position, and then it'll be shown, and you eliminate the jump effect. So, and this is down here is an example of a pop-up panel. So let's talk a little bit about CSS, actually, and how it works with GWT. So GWT widgets, we use CSS for visual styling, right? And the way it works is each widget has a style name, and it binds to a CSS class. Are most of you familiar with CSS classes, or what a class is in CSS? Okay, if you're not, then just say you're not, and we can talk about it. So anyway, what you do is you say like widget set style name, and say it's called my widget style, and then the CSS rule would look something like this in your CSS file, .my widget style, then padding 3 pixels or something like that, right? Now, here's something that kind of was added in 1.4, and I'm going to kind of explain how it works before I explain why it's there, so that it's a little confusing, but hopefully this will clarify it. GWT has the concept of like a primary, secondary, and dependent styles, right? These are our concepts. It's not like CSS defines these. So here's a class name for a widget, and when I say this is a class name for a widget, I mean if you actually looked at the HTML and actually looked at the class attribute, this is what it would look like. I'm not saying this is what you write in GWT. So if you look here, there's my widget style. That's the primary style name. Another style is the secondary style name, and my widget style dash selected is a dependent style. So what do these mean, right? So a dependent style is always of the form, basically the primary style name hyphen the dependent style suffix. So in this case, if I wanted to set this style, like my widget style hyphen selected, really I'm just saying widget.setDependentStyleName selected. And it goes, oh, okay, well, I'm going to take the primary style name, append a hyphen, and then that. And that's how you get that. And the cool thing about this is, well, what happens if I change the primary style name, like my widget style? Well, all the dependent style names are updated. For example, So this is what you had before, and then I call widget.set style primary name, and I say I'm going to call it cool style. Well, first it changes the primary one, that's obvious. Another style stays the same, and then my widget style dash selected becomes cool style dash selected. It updated the actual dependent style name. So, and you can remove a dependent style. So say I'm like, okay, you know what, I want to remove that style. I just say w remove dependent style name selected, and cool style dash selected goes away. So why do you need primary and dependent styles, right? Like why is all this stuff in here? Well, the reason it's there is, you know, when you want to change the style of something depending on its state, it's a lot easier to do this with a concept like primary styles and dependent styles, right? So for example, if something's selected, then you say add dependent style name selected, otherwise remove dependent style name selected. How would you do this otherwise? Like how would you go ahead and do this if we didn't have this in here? Well, what you'd have to do is you'd have to say, okay, get the whole style name, now parse out, like grab the first class name and then attach hyphen, actually that's a typo, it should be hyphen selected, and then search through the string, and then if I want to get rid of it, then remove that and reset the style name. Or get the current style name, add that on, and add it. So you have to do all this kind of parsing code, which is kind of ugly, right? And even worse, which really sucks, is what about the set style name implementation, right? Like what if the guy wants to change his style name, but you don't want him to necessarily blow away everything else? Like what if there's already this sort of other style set? You would have to rewrite set style name to basically do what we did, to go back through and update, say, oh, okay, well, don't actually blow away the whole style name, but actually just replace the prefixes. So you would basically have to reinvent the concept of dependent style and primary style yourself. So instead, we rolled that into the UI library with GWT 1.4. So I've been talking a little bit in the abstract here about like, okay, what does it look like, your class names in HTML, but really, what does it look like, what does your CSS file actually look like, right? It actually looks like this. So for my widget style, it's a normal class like I show you, but then for expanded, or selected, that's a typo, it would be my widget style hyphen selected and then ... and whatever the styles are. The thing about that is, the reason, you might wonder like, why'd you guys do that? I mean, why like these hyphenated styles? Can't you just say like my widget style space, expanded? And the reason why you can't do that is CSS doesn't let you. You cannot specify a style rule in CSS that says, apply this style to the element when it has this class and it has this class. You can do the or, but you can't do the and, right? So, but actually, if you look below there, like my widget style space dot expanded, that's a legal style. It actually, but what does it really mean? That means, okay, look for an element that has a class of expanded and has a parent element that has a parent element up the chain that has a class of my widget style, and apply that style rule to that. So this only works when there's a parent-child relationship, but that's just sort of like an aside, really. This is how your CSS file, this is how you declare like these different states or different styles for different states. Just a note on secondary styles. Like I mentioned that another style that in the example was a secondary style. Secondary styles are just really, they're just another style name that you could use for the widget. It's not tied to the primary style. It's just, if you want to add another style name that has nothing to do with all of that, you can. That's all that is. So you might ask, like, CSS, like why don't you have like set border methods or set padding or even some other concept like set space or something like that? Well, the reason is that's a hard problem, right? Essentially, we don't want to reinvent CSS, and we don't want to add like a billion methods to correspond to all the visual changes you can make. That's a lot of work, and CSS does a good job of what it's meant to do, right? Now, there are, as I mentioned, cross-browser CSS issues. The thing about that is, GWT's all about cross-browser compatibility. So how do we handle that if we make you write CSS? It kind of seems like kind of going against each other there. But the way we try to shield you from this is the things in CSS that would cause cross-browser problems, we probably, or we attempt to handle in specific widgets and panels. So a lot of the issues that come with CSS, cross-browser issues, are with layout, right? But if the thing about it is, the attributes you really shouldn't need to use are things like position, float, z-index, left, top, right, bottom. Like, why set absolute positioning on a widget directly, right? Use an absolute panel. Like, why set a z-index? Use a pop-up panel, right? Do you need to use float? You might, you may, but chances are there's probably a panel that meets your needs. And so the typical attributes you'd set are like margin, padding, border, background, color, font, things that are like not really controversial. At least that's the idea behind it. And if you've found like some crazy CSS that you need to do that, you know, that doesn't seem to be gelling well with the rest of GWT, it's cross-browser, it's not compatible, then tell us, you know, and maybe we need to create a widget or a panel that does take care of that for us, for you. So let's talk a little bit about patterns for building user interfaces. So we've talked about like maybe styling a bit and layout and things like that, but now it's like, well, from a software engineering standpoint, how do I design my UI, right? Like, how do I actually design the components? So, well, actually, before I go to that slide, let me just take look at our mail app for a second, right? It's if you look at it, like, let's just strip it down a little bit. You've got this view here where you can sort of choose a different folder, right? And then you've got a list here of all the messages in that folder, and then you've got like a view of what the current message selected is. Pretty typical for a mail app, right? So the first thing you want to do is kind of split the UI down into logical components. Hopefully these names, like, I know folder chooser view is a little awkward, but anyway, you know what I'm getting at. The idea is that really, like, let's have these three components here, like folder chooser view on the left, mail list view to show like the list of messages, and then mail preview view, actually. So the thing is, and actually I've forgotten about like tasks and contacts. I've just kind of forgotten about that. Don't worry about that. We won't go into that much detail. So what you can use to actually build these components is something called the Composite Class, right? The Composite Class, it's used to wrap another widget in order to hide its methods. That's the main point of it. It's really just an abstraction. And it's really useful when you're creating an aggregate, a widget that's really an aggregate of other widgets, right? And what you want to do, the thing is, if you didn't have a composite, then really maybe you've got this panel with a bunch of widgets in it. Say you subclass a panel, and you're kind of, this panel's lying around in your UI, and it's a little awkward, right? It's like interacting with a panel. You could even grab widgets from it. You kind of want to hide that a little bit to have a logical separation between different components, right? So what you can do with a composite is only expose methods that you want other components to really use from the outside to get information or do things, right? And the way this typically works is one of the widgets, like if you have an aggregate widget, what you have is typically like a panel behind the scenes, and you've added the widgets to it. And what Composite forces you to do is it says, okay, I'm a composite, but you have to tell me what I really am. So behind the scenes, you have to call init widget to say like, what is really the primary widget? So maybe you have a vertical panel with a bunch of widgets in it, and then you say init widget of that vertical panel, and really that's what it shows up on the screen. But from the outside, nobody knows really that it's a vertical panel or any of the widgets in it. So let's show how you kind of use this. So the folder chooser view, remember the thing about picking a folder. You've got this class here, and it extends composite, and really what the main UI component in there is a tree, right? So in the constructor, I create a new tree, and then there's ... to show you like that's where you're adding all the tree items with inbox, drafts, and all that. And then the final thing I do is init widget of folder tree, because that's the primary widget, really. So you might say like, wait a minute, you just told me that this is best for aggregation of widgets, right? Like you didn't aggregate anything, you wrapped a tree. Like, why would you do that, right? I'll get to why I did that in a second, just bear with me. But we'll get to that point. So let's talk about the mail list view now, right? And how would that work? So if you look back here, actually, the mail list view really it's a table. It's a table really with 3 columns. There's a header here, pretty header, styled by Kelly, and actually it's also got a nav bar here, like 1 to 10 of 37, older, newer, that type of thing, right? So really, when you look at the code, what it really is you've got a flex table there and a nav bar, like as a horizontal panel, and in there you would put, how many items you have and older, newer, and stuff like that. So the construction code, you create a new table, then probably set up the headers and all that, and part of setting up the headers is adding to the fourth column really that nav bar over all the way to the right, actually. And then you're initializing you're calling a init widget with mail list. So this is an example of, like I said, really you've got like a horizontal panel, but you've added it to the mail list flex table, and you're calling an init widget on the mail list, which is really the base panel, right, in this case. So we've kind of talked about how you sort of componentize these things, but it's only really useful when you figure out, like, how do these things really communicate, right? That's where things really get kind of sticky, right? It's sort of like, well, the folder list view, when the user picks something, when the user chooses a particular folder, the mail list view needs to update, right? You need to show all the messages in there for that folder. But then also, when you click an item in the mail list view, really the preview mail view needs to know about that so it can show that current message. So how do you wire all this up? And Kelly alluded to this in his usability talk, actually, which is really cool. There's what you want to do is you want to define application-specific events that serve as a communication mechanism between UI components. So maybe the folder list view, or actually it fires folder chosen events, right? Maybe that's what it does. And then the mail list view subscribes to those, so he wants to know when they happen. And when they happen, he can handle it and sort of populate his list of messages. And maybe he, in turn, fires item selected events, which the preview mail view could then subscribe to so that he can show that message that corresponds to the selected item. So I'll show you a bit of code on how you would wire this up. So let's pretend we have our folder list view like before, right? And it extends Composite, and that the same code that was there before, but instead it also implements this interface called fires folder chosen events, right? And that has two methods on it, and add event handler of folder chosen handler and remove event handler. And behind the scenes we have an array list, folder chosen handler list, and we're just going to add these guys to it, right? So that's the first part of it, just having the list of guys that care about the event, right? The second part of it is, all right, well, that's great, but you actually have to, when do you actually do something with them? When do you tell them that things happened, right? So chances are that there's probably in the folder component, there's probably something called choose folder, like a private method that gets called whenever you select a folder with the mouse or with the keyboard. And what you would do here is you'd construct a new event. An event, all it is, it's nothing fancy. All it is it's just an object that contains some information about the event. So in this case, there's this event, and I pass in the folder, the current folder that was selected. And then I didn't write the for loop here, but for all the handlers in the folder chosen in that list, I'm going to call on folder chosen and pass in that event object, right? So let's look at the guy who actually cares about them, right? Mail list view. So what does he do? So he extends Composite like before, same code, but now he implements folder chosen handler, which has a method on folder chosen, and it takes in a folder chosen event. And really, this is what's getting called on the other side, right? He registers for it, this gets called, this happens, right? He gets the folder out, and then he just does something with it. Like probably looks at it, oh, it's the inbox folder, maybe get all the messages and populate the thing. So how do you subscribe, right? Subscribing's easy. So in your on-module load or somewhere else where it's kind of like, you're not in specifically one of these components, you'd basically say folder list view, add event handler, mail list view, right? And this works because mail list view implements folder chosen handler. So that's kind of what's going on here, actually. So why do this, right? Like, why even bother with all this event wiring, all this funkiness? Why would you do this? The cool thing about it is, remember before I said that, you could actually do the folder chooser view. You could do that with a tree, like it's a tree, right? Why did I wrap that in a composite? Well, think about it this way. If I left it as a tree, then mail list view would actually have to be handling or subscribing to tree selection events and handling tree selection events, right? So really, then it's really tied to the fact that they used a tree over there. So what if later on he's like, you know what, I want to use a stack panel or something like that, or some other crazy widget. Well, then you got to change the implementation because it's not tree events anymore, it's something else. But with a composite now, that's totally separate. You could do whatever you want. You could change your folder chooser view, implement it however you want. The event mechanism doesn't change. It stays the same. So the other cool thing about this is folder chooser view and mail list view, they don't need to know about each other at all. They're separate, right? So the thing is, if you didn't do it by a way of passing events or having this event mechanism, what you would have to do is something like in the choose folder method, that private method, you would have to call mail list view dot, populate your list or something. So what does that mean? It means you have to hold a reference to mail list view first of all, right? And you've got this tight coupling between these two components. So, and another thing that's a problem with it is, what if more people want to know about folders being chosen? So what do? Do you add another reference to that other guy that cares, and then add another line and choose folder like, other component dot do something with this folder, right? It doesn't scale well, but with like a general event mechanism like this, you just say like add event handler, he doesn't care. He's like, whatever, I'm going to just go through all of you guys and tell you that an event happened. I don't care what you do with it. I don't even care who you are, right? So, and that's the way you want it to be. And this really can help to clean up things when you have a complex UI with a lot of components that interact. So let's talk about just lazy instantiation here a little bit. The idea behind this is don't create things that you don't need yet or may not even need. So if you look at tab panel, and I'm not knocking tab panel, it's a good component. The thing about it is it doesn't do, to my knowledge, doesn't do lazy instantiation, right? You basically add new tabs and you add widgets to it, right? But you're adding them right there. You've constructed them, basically. So it's like, okay, the weird thing about it is, remember, a tab panel is something that shows one widget at a time, right? So if you're showing one widget at a time, the guy may never even see the other widgets if he's not on that tab, so why construct them if he hasn't seen them yet, right? Like, why do that? So let's try to do a lazy instantiable tab panel. This is a little bit of a poor man's tab panel. Like, this is not ready to go into the GWT widget library. It's meant to illustrate a point about lazy instantiation. So imagine we have like foo widget and bar widget, right? These are the two widgets, and we're going to have two tabs that correspond to them, right? So we're going to have these two methods here, like get foo widget instance and get bar widget instance. And when you call them, it does this. This is basically the lazy instantiation pattern. It goes, if it's null, then construct it. Otherwise, just return it, or just return it in all cases. So let's look at actually the code down here in init on actually how we construct this guy. So we're going to create a new vertical panel. Oh, and by the way, a tab panel is really just a tab bar and a deck panel. So I'm kind of deconstructing it in some ways. So we're going to have a vertical panel and a tab bar. And we're going to add the foo tab and the bar tab. But we're not actually going to add any widgets because the tab bar doesn't take widgets, really. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a listener. And we're going to add a listener, which exists already, for when a tab is selected. And what we're going to do is, if the tab index is 0, then the widget to be shown just call get foo widget instance. Or if it's something else, get bar widget instance. And then we're going to remove, if there is an existing shown widget in the vertical panel, remove it, and then add the new one into the panel. So with a pattern like this, you're never actually, if you're not on that particular tab, that guy's not constructed until the first time you click on the tab. Then he's constructed, and then forevermore he's there, right? So if you don't ever click on that tab, then it never gets constructed. I've cheated a little bit here because obviously with a tab panel, you have to always be showing at least the first tab first. So this code doesn't actually show you that really, foo widget should really be shown initially because you have a tab and there's a foo widget. Like, you have to be showing something underneath, but you get the point. So I'm going to just go briefly through some tips, tricks, and gotchas here. These are just like totally random. They're not even ordered really well. It's just some things I found interesting. Maybe you guys will find them interesting. Here's kind of a cool thing, right? I didn't talk much about image bundle at all. I think quite a few people know about it, but one thing that's cool is that our tree class, right now, it has images, right? It has two images, a plus and a minus. When you expand it, to show if there's children and stuff like that, and then you can just contract it, right? So the thing is, right now, if you use our tree widget, those images are bundled, but we're going to make a request for that bundle to get those tree images. But what if you're already using bundles, right? Like, why would you make a request for our little bundle and then your bundle, like, why don't we bundle all the bundles, right? It's Christmas, right? So anyway, what you could do is you can just like, say you have like icon image bundle and photo image bundle, and then there's tree images, which is the one in trees, right? You basically, like, because of interface inheritance, you can say like, okay, my image bundle, it should really be called like Uber image bundle, extends icon image bundle, photo image bundle, and tree images, right? And then if you do a gwt.create on that, right, what you're going to really get is a bundle that contains all of the images that were defined in all of those bundles, right? And then tree actually takes a constructor that says, hey, if you have a bundle of images, pass those in. So I'll just pass in my image bundle, and that works because my image bundle implements tree images. So there you've just saved yourself an HTTP request, right? And in the future, if we add other things that have bundled images, you can use the same trick. And this actually just falls out just because of, basically interface inheritance. We didn't write any special code to handle this case. This just worked because of the way GWT works, the way interface inheritance works. So you might say, like, you might have heard of this thing like abstract image prototype, and you're like, man, that sounds scary. Like, why don't you guys return an image? I can deal with images, but abstract image prototype, what's that, right? Well, the reason why we did that is, creating an image widget involves creating a DOM element. So why create it before you need it? Like a typical case is a disclosure panel, right? You've got this thing where you have a little arrow, and it points to the right, and you click on it, then it points down. Really, that's one image, right? So, but it's really it really shows two different states, but it's really one image. So if you have a prototype, what you can do with the prototype is you can say, hey, if there's an image, I want you to apply this prototype to this image, right? And you just say like apply to the image, and it's going to basically morph that image completely into what the prototype says it is. And by doing that, you basically saved on a DOM element, right? You only have one. You didn't create one unnecessarily, and you can get the switching between the states, right? And prototypes, these are very lightweight. All they are is a string of HTML. That's it. Just the HTML needed to construct it. That's all they are. This is a little bit on CSS. Don't set position absolute on pop-up panels and dialog boxes. We do this for you, and actually, the way we implement these things, you may not be setting position absolute on the thing you think you're setting, right? There's actually, on the Mac, we actually have an extra layer, a shim layer, to prevent scroll bars underneath from shining through. So by you styling it that way, you might actually be setting position absolute on the wrong element because of this implementation. But the point of it is really, you don't need to, right? We did that for you. We handled like the guts of it. So when you set things like this, you may get the wrong behavior, actually. This is something you guys probably all know, like specifying dimensions in CSS, where you can use relative units. So say no to pixels, inches, centimeters, millimeters, and basically say yes to, actually that's wrong. This should be EM, not PX. But anyway, it should be EM, so I'll have to correct that slide. Just a last little fun thing. I'm kind of running out of time here, but I'll just say this really quickly. This is something that a lot of the GWT team members knew, but me, Alex, and Eric, a couple engineers, we kind of ran into this in a different way a few days ago. What's wrong with this code, right? You got a label, you create an image, you add a load listener. On load, you say, hey, set the text, it's loaded. And on error, you say, hey, set the text, it didn't load. And then, we'll after defining that, we'll say, okay, the text is going to be like waiting to load, right? Well, the problem with this is, on load can be fired actually before you get to new label waiting to load. So you might say, wait a minute, JavaScript's single threaded, right? That's crazy talk. You can't do that, right? Actually, it is single threaded, but there is reentrant behavior, right? Where you can basically, an event can come back in and fire before you even get down there. It's not always the model that all this JavaScript code's going to finish, UI's going to update, event loop's going to pump. Some of these guys, like especially in IE, do something a little crazy sometimes. So that's what kind of happens here. And so really the way to correct this, you could put set text calls in a deferred command. That's not really fixing the problem. Really, when you have an event coming in like that, just make sure you're always ready to handle it. So you can do, even if you think, don't have determinations like that, oh, this is going to finish first. Like, I'll wait for the event loop to go through here. You can basically say, instantiate the label up front or add null checks in your event handler. That's probably the best way to do it. But that's just to pique your interest, make you aware that there are some weird things like that. We're trying to pin down these cases and document them so that you can be aware of them. But that's basically it. So here's some resources, and if you have questions, please feel free.
Is it totally safe to use thin images for your images now?
Yes and no. I mean, that's not a good answer, right? So yeah, you can use. It's not, if you try to use like just a PNG image on the straight image class, that's not going to work, right? But that's a bug that we need to fix, really, so that, you know, in the case where you do use a PNG image, we actually apply the alpha image filter loader thing so that it actually works in IE with transparency. So that's a bug. I don't know if we'll get to it for 1.5, but definitely 1.6.
Is there any particular reason the layouts were combined with the panels? For example, in Swing, you have the UI component separate from the layouts. In GWT, you kind of have combined them together.
So in Swing, you have you're saying that it's not actually you have like a layout manager type idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it was, and maybe Joel and Kelly can talk better to this, but I think it was really done that way just because if you were to do something like that, like having a layout manager, I think that might be a tricky problem to basically try and solve, like when you're running in JavaScript, you know, because those things are kind of actively managing the way things are laid out. But this is kind of really in an active behavior. We're really deferring to the web browser. We're just trying to basically put the constructs in such a way that things get laid out properly according to the way browsers understand them, as opposed to doing things dynamically where, you know, you're sort of actively managing where things are. I don't know if I might not be answering the right question here, but
no, that's fine. I was just curious because it's a little bit of a different mindset for Swing programmers.
Yeah, we took some concepts from Swing and then others we didn't, and in some cases we changed some constructs like that. Like, for example, the old way we did the whole eventing pattern, the way I showed it now is how we want to do it, but you'll look in the old stuff, we have this whole like sources click events and click listener type thing. That was kind of not, and no event objects, that's kind of not what Swing did, and then later we said, oh, you know what, Swing kind of had that the right way, so we were kind of trying to move to that pattern. So.
Okay, one more question. Anyone?
Hi, we use vertical split panel and tab panel to the root panel.
Okay.
It is behaving differently than
So
each browser.
A tab panel and a vertical split panel?
Correct.
Okay, we should probably talk about what the weird behavior is. Like vertical split panel is, it's something newer with GWT 1.4, and it does a lot of like real wizardry to be able to do what it does. So there may be some interactions we're not aware of.
Yeah, I had a talk with Kelly. I think,
yeah?
Yeah. So he asked me to send a email saying
Okay.
that what is the problem.
Yeah, I think that'd probably be best. Or if you have it on your computer and we could take a look at it, maybe we could take some guesses for like a quick fix. But I mean, he spent like weeks in a hole trying to get that to work. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some weird stuff that may happen with interactions.
And
on
one more
widgets.
question.
Sure.
This CSS, we used a small and X small.
Oh, X small, like the X small to make really small font? Yeah.
Yeah. But it is showing one browser to another browser is differently.
Yeah, that could be the case, right? Some of these things, like I noticed that actually some of these things, like these common names like light gray, for example, does not exist. That name does not exist in Internet Explorer, but it does in Mozilla. So sometimes what you may want to just go with like the numeric equivalent of what that is, you know, because you aren't preventing people from changing the font size, right? Because you can still change the font size whether you say X small or not, right? So you may just want to find out the numeric equivalent is and do that.
Oh,
yeah.
okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Rajeev.
Thanks very much, everybody.
you.